William is not taking any more crap.
When Prince William reportedly confirmed that Lady Louise Windsor would receive a meaningful inheritance, it quietly stirred emotions inside the royal circle. For years, many had overlooked the soft-spoken young royal, but this decision changed everything. Behind palace doors, reactions were swift, and not everyone was pleased. Was it strategy, surprise, or something far more personal? And what does this surprising twist mean for the future of the royal family? Join us as we uncover William's shocking confirmation about Lady Louise's inheritance and Camilla's surprising move. The battle for the Grey Garden. On the evening of January 30th, 2026, Buckingham Palace released a statement that ended 70 years of carefully maintained royal silence. It was short, it was precise, and it sent shockwaves through the monarchy. Lady Louise Windsor, the quiet and largely private 22-year-old granddaughter of Queen Elizabeth II, had officially inherited a hidden Scottish estate that almost no one knew existed. Not the public, not royal watchers, and not even several senior members of the royal family. The property was known only by a single name: the Grey Garden. Location: deep in the harsh and isolated Scottish Highlands, was guarded with unusual secrecy. For decades, its existence was treated almost like classified information. But the real drama had been building long before the announcement. For months, leading up to January 30th, 2026, quiet but intense discussions had been taking place behind the closed doors of Clarence House. There, Queen Camilla and members of the Parker Bowles family were reportedly working behind the scenes to secure control of the estate. Surveyors had assessed the land. High-profile legal teams had examined ownership structures. Plans were being discussed, plans that would reshape the quiet retreat into a symbol of new influence within the royal structure. They believed the estate could be claimed. They believed the legal path was open. They believed victory was certain. Because long before any of them began strategizing, Queen Elizabeth II had already made her move. To understand why this inheritance created such tension, you have to understand what the Grey Garden truly represented. Acquired in 1952, the same year Elizabeth ascended the throne, the estate was never formally tied to the crown. Its deed did not carry a royal designation. Instead, it was placed under a private holding company, designed to remain permanently discreet. On paper, it appeared ordinary. In reality, it was deeply personal. The world knew Elizabeth as a symbol of duty, a monarch defined by schedules, state visits, and red boxes filled with government papers. But within the stone walls of the Grey Garden, away from cameras and ceremony, she could simply be herself. It was here that state documents were reviewed in complete privacy. It was here that she escaped the relentless scrutiny of public life. The isolation was so profound that Prince Philip reportedly found it too remote for comfort. Even more surprising, King Charles III had never once stepped onto its grounds. That distance would later prove crucial, because when discussions about the estate's future began circulating after the late Queen's passing, the king had little personal familiarity with it. Without that connection, defending it became legally and emotionally complicated. But Elizabeth had anticipated all of this. She understood that the real legacy of her reign was not stored in crowns, diamonds, or titles. It was preserved in letters, journals, private reflections, and unfiltered moments, the human story behind the public sovereign. Those materials, according to insiders, were safeguarded within the Grey Garden. And then came the decisive detail. Hidden within the private deed was a clause so carefully written that it left no room for interpretation. It named a single heir. It explicitly prevented outside claims. It ensured that the estate could not be absorbed, repurposed, or politically reshaped. The chosen heir was Lady Louise Windsor. At just 22, she became the sole guardian of a property that represented far more than land. She inherited privacy, history, and responsibility. In choosing Louise, a young woman known for her reserved nature and quiet interest in history, Elizabeth appeared to favor character over ambition. By doing so, she bypassed present power structures to protect something far more fragile: memory. The battle for the Grey Garden was effectively over before it ever reached public view. Legal teams withdrew, plans dissolved, expectations collapsed. What remains is a decision that may quietly influence the monarchy for the next 100 years. Is this simply about property, or about control, trust, and who would guard the untold story of the woman behind the crown? What are the mysteries of the property itself? Let's take a closer look. Secrets of Grey Garden. For over 70 years, the British monarchy successfully kept the public completely unaware of a multi-million-pound estate. In the carefully kept records of the Duchy of Lancaster, and in the monarch's private financial papers, the property was never listed by its real name. Instead, it was quietly hidden under the ordinary label of site fee. To any auditor or official who happened to review the books, it looked like nothing more than a small utility bill or a basic land maintenance cost. It was a brilliant example of something hidden so well that it appeared completely normal. The Grey Garden stands deep within the wild and harsh mountains of the Cairngorms in the Scottish Highlands. This is not the soft green landscape people see in cheerful holiday pictures from Balmoral Estate. Instead, it is a land of hard granite mountains, ancient Caledonian pine forests, and wide-open moorland swept by strong winds. The weather there can change suddenly and dangerously within minutes. The house sits in a natural hollow between old hunting routes, once favored by Queen Victoria. It is extremely remote and carefully positioned so it cannot be seen from modern hiking paths or public viewpoints. The story of how it was bought shows a side of Elizabeth II that many people never fully understood. The property was purchased in 1952, only months after her father died, and she unexpectedly became queen. While the young monarch was preparing for her coronation and stepping into global attention, she was also quietly securing a private escape from royal life. The deed for the Grey Garden did not mention any royal title. It did not refer to Her Majesty or to the Crown Estate. Instead, the house was bought through a private holding company run by a financial advisor who had previously managed the Queen Mother's personal Highland inheritance. By keeping the purchase out of the official royal registry from the very beginning, Elizabeth made sure it remained her personal property, controlled by normal civil law rather than royal tradition. The house itself reflects the personality of the woman who bought it. Built from dark grey stone, it was designed to survive the tough Scottish winters. Inside, there are no gold-covered ceilings, no large ballrooms, and no grand reception rooms for visiting world leaders. It was created for one person. According to the very few former staff members who were bound by the site fee rule, the Queen would quietly retreat there for 5 or 6 days at a time. She still received her daily red government boxes and continued state business, but she worked in total privacy. There were no formal meetings, no social events, and no public performance. At the Grey Garden, she was not the Queen, she was simply Elizabeth. Other members of the royal family felt differently about the place. Prince Philip reportedly disliked it. He enjoyed activity, sport, and constant movement, and he found the deep silence of the house uncomfortable. After the 1960s, he rarely returned. Anne spent a few weekends nearby in her early 20s, but she felt the isolation was unsettling and the atmosphere heavy. Princess Margaret visited only once and stayed less than 24 hours before leaving for the more social setting of Birkhall, saying the house felt like a monastery meant for one person. The most striking detail involves Charles III. Although he deeply loves Scotland, he never entered the Grey Garden at any point in his life. For Charles, royal properties were places to restore, improve, and use as platforms for his ideas about architecture and the environment. Will control eventually change hands? Let's find out. Grey Garden power shift. When Queen Camilla quietly began her effort to claim the estate in 2025, King Charles III could not defend it with real feeling. To him, it was just a nameless patch of land on a distant map, a quiet property he barely remembered. He did not understand that it had once been the most private and sacred refuge of his mother, Elizabeth II. But what made the Grey Garden so powerful and so dangerous to anyone trying to control the royal story was not the land itself. It was what lay inside. Behind its heavy greystone walls sat something far more valuable than fields or forests. The house contained handwritten letters, undeveloped photographic negatives, and rare voice recordings. None of these were ever digitized. None were sent to the official royal archives at Windsor Castle. They remained exactly as they were decades ago, untouched, unfiltered, and unseen. This was raw history, personal history, the kind that could reshape how the monarchy is understood. For over 70 years, the collection remained hidden, waiting for someone who understood a simple truth. The real strength of the crown does not lie in what is displayed to the public, but in what is carefully kept out of sight. And as 2026 would later prove, Elizabeth II had already chosen who would one day hold that responsibility. The campaign for the Grey Garden did not begin loudly. It began quietly, almost invisibly, in the dusty offices of the Duchy of Lancaster. By the autumn of 2024, Queen Camilla had been queen for more than 2 years, yet she knew there was still something missing from her sphere of influence. Elizabeth II had seemed almost legendary, larger than life. Camilla, in contrast, was often viewed as practical and modern. She understood something important. In royal life, power is not only about crowns and titles. It is about symbols. It is about controlling history. It is about owning land that carries meaning. Leaked palace papers later revealed that as early as October 2024, Camilla began quietly asking questions about certain site fee accounts. She never mentioned the Grey Garden directly. Doing so would have alarmed senior palace officials. Instead, she described her interest as a routine financial review. She asked whether any royal properties had been left out of the official duchy records. Her reasoning was simple and strategic. If a property was not formally declared, it was vulnerable. And anything vulnerable could be reshaped, reorganized, and eventually claimed. She was not alone. The Parker Bowles family, long positioned near but not fully inside royal wealth, saw a rare opportunity. Tom Parker Bowles, already known for his work as a respected food writer, had quietly begun exploring ideas for luxury Highland culinary tourism. His advisors had even researched land regulations near the Cairngorms months before the public had ever heard of the Grey Garden. To them, this was more than a building. It was leverage. If they gained control of the estate, they could help shape how history remembered the Queen's most private world. Their family name would become linked forever with one of the most intimate sanctuaries connected to the House of Windsor. By early January 2026, the quiet maneuvering moved into a more personal space, the drawing rooms of Birk Hall, Charles's beloved Scottish home. There, during a private evening meeting, Camilla made her formal move. She presented the king with a beautifully bound leather proposal. She did not describe it as a takeover. She called it stewardship, restoration, protection. Her argument was careful and persuasive. She suggested placing the Grey Garden under joint management between the Crown and her charitable foundations. She spoke of creating a peaceful retreat for British writers. She outlined conservation projects tied to rewilding efforts. She proposed limited invitation-only heritage tourism that could financially sustain the estate for the next 100 years. To an outsider, it would have sounded like a brilliant plan, a forward-thinking vision to save an aging property and secure its future. But behind the polished language and noble promises lay something much deeper, a quiet struggle over memory, influence, and who truly controls the hidden chapters of royal history. Does Camilla actually have secret plans to gain total control? Let's find out. Camilla's ambition and mistakes. By taking control of the estate, Camilla would place herself closer than ever to the most private and protected parts of Balmoral. Even more importantly, she would gain access to the archives, a treasure trove of history and secrets. She was not asking for a small cottage or a weekend retreat. What she sought was much bigger. She wanted influence, heritage, and power. Her ambition, however, led her to make a major misstep, possibly driven by her confidence that victory was imminent. Weeks before formally presenting her proposal to the king, she had secretly sent private surveyors to the estate. Under the guise of environmental study, these experts were seen wandering the moors with high-tech equipment, drawing up restoration budgets and mapping heritage plans. This breach of protocol did not go unnoticed. Local Highland residents, many of whom had served the late Queen loyally for decades, were deeply protective of her privacy and immediately sensed that something was amiss. When King Charles finally received Camilla's formal request, he did not respond with the fiery outburst many expected from him. Instead, he acted with quiet, deliberate royal authority. Meetings were delayed, consultations with constitutional advisors were initiated, and the Royal Estate Council was tasked with reviewing ownership arrangements that had remained untouched since 1952. Charles found himself in a delicate position. He loved his wife and respected her drive for modernizing change, but he was equally a man devoted to tradition and the memory of his mother. He was being asked to give away a piece of history he had never truly known. His hesitation opened a small window, and Princess Anne, ever observant and strategic, was ready to seize it. The tension reached a peak during a closed-door session on January 12, 2026. Only the king, his private secretary, and 2 senior advisors were present. The meeting had been scheduled to finalize the transfer of stewardship. As Camilla's representatives prepared to show their final architectural renderings, Charles delivered a calm but firm message. The estate was not available for reassignment. Not now, not ever. He framed the refusal not as a personal rejection of Camilla, but as the result of a pre-existing private settlement, one that lay beyond the authority of the crown. Had marshaled every tool at her disposal, lawyers, plans, personal access to the king, but all of it was blocked by a force she could not name. In that moment, she began to understand the truth. The late queen had anticipated this challenge years ago and had put a guardian in place that no queen consort could overcome. For the Parker Bowles family, the dream of a Highland empire vanished overnight. Surveyors were called back, tourism consultants were silenced, and the leather-bound proposals were quietly filed away. But the shock of rejection was mild compared to the revelation that would come 3 days later, when the world, and the Parker Bowles family, finally learned the identity of the woman who had stood in their way all along. The campaign was over. For Camilla, however, the true struggle for her place in history was only beginning. On January 15, 2026, the official announcement was made. It was more than a formal transfer of property. It was the legal enforcement of a plan Queen Elizabeth II had quietly set in motion years before her death. Why did Queen Camilla's ambitious campaign collapse so completely? Let's find out. Queen Camilla's estate failure. To understand why Queen Camilla's attempt to claim the estate failed so completely, you have to look at a document signed in the shadowy library of Windsor Castle in October 2021. This wasn't the Queen's main will, which dealt with the big palaces and the crown jewels. This was a separate, very specific legal document, a personal legacy deed designed to operate outside the usual crown estate system. It was her ultimate safety net. At the center of this deed was a section that royal lawyers whispered about in a mix of fear and admiration. Clause 31. The name was a deliberate nod to the 31st day of the Queen's own reign, the first time she had ever visited the Grey Garden alone as monarch. Clause 31 was simple, ruthless, and precise. It set 3 conditions that made the estate untouchable. The property could only pass on after the death of all the designated trustees. It was completely removed from any future parliamentary control or crown oversight. And the final crushing rule for Camilla and her ambitions. Queen Camilla, her children, and their direct descendants were permanently banned from owning, managing, or even accessing the estate. Before the 2026 announcement, only 4 people knew about this clause. The Queen's personal lawyer, Princess Anne, the late Queen's longtime private archivist, and Prince Edward. Each had taken a secrecy vow stronger than any oath to the crown. They silently watched as Camilla's surveyors roamed the moors and the king faced pressure at Birkhall, knowing all along that Camilla would never hold the key to the Grey Garden. But why Lady Louise? Why would the Queen leave such a secret estate to her 22-year-old granddaughter? A young woman who was not a working royal and had spent her life avoiding attention. The answer lies in the summers of 2019, 2020, and 2021. While other family members arrived at Balmoral with staff and social plans, Louise came with just a book and a pair of walking boots. Former palace staff noticed a special connection between the elderly queen and her youngest granddaughter. Louise didn't perform or seek attention. A lady-in-waiting later remembered, "She was just present." During those last Highland summers, Louise and the Queen spent long hours in private libraries and walking the quiet corridors of the estate. While outsiders thought they were bonding over carriage driving and horses, Louise was actually learning how to handle the Queen's personal papers. She was the only family member trusted to manage the materials that were never meant for the official archives. Queen Elizabeth saw in Louise a reflection of her sister, Princess Margaret. Sharp intelligence, a deep love of history, but without the drama, rebellion, or need for public recognition. Louise had quiet loyalty, a rare trait in a family often defined by louder personalities. The Queen knew Louise would treat the Grey Garden as a sanctuary, not a trophy or business opportunity. The legacy deed was signed just months after Prince Philip's funeral. Elizabeth was preparing for the end and knew that once she was gone, modernization and commercial interests would threaten her most private spaces. By bypassing her own children and leaving the estate directly to Louise, she avoided the politics of immediate succession. It was, in effect, a gift of moral authority. When the palace solicitor finally opened the sealed inheritance letter in late 2025, the wording was unmistakably Queen Elizabeth. The Grey Garden was described as a refuge, not a monument. The archives inside were meant to remain the private thoughts of a woman, not the public record of a monarch. By giving these materials to Louise, the Queen ensured that her unfiltered voice, her private diaries, recordings to her grandchildren, and candid letters to world leaders would be kept by someone who valued her as a person, more than as a monarch. Why did it shock the palace? Could this really be what the late Queen Elizabeth wanted? Let's find out. The Queen's final secret. The shock that rippled through the senior courtiers and the Parker Bowles family was not just about losing a piece of land. As the news of her inheritance spread across London in January 2026, it became obvious that the late Queen's final act of loyalty had not been to the state or to tradition, but to the truth of her own life. And she had entrusted that truth to the one person she believed would never allow it to be rewritten or diluted for convenience. The announcement had barely been public for 48 hours when the air inside Windsor Castle grew stifling. Outside, the British public celebrated Louise's rise as a refreshing return to tradition, a symbol of honor and continuity. Inside, however, the private apartments were tense. The silence was heavy, thick with unspoken resentment and pointed, icy glances. Queen Camilla was not a woman who accepted defeat quietly. She had spent decades navigating the most dangerous currents of public opinion, court politics, and royal etiquette to reach the side of the king. To be sidelined by a 22-year-old girl and a legally unbreakable deed from a deceased monarch was not only a tactical loss. The confrontation that would later become the subject of hushed whispers throughout the palace occurred on the evening of January 26, 2026, in the Long Gallery at Windsor Castle. Senior courtiers later described it as a glass chandelier moment, a rare point in time when the tension in the room was so intense it felt as if even the crystal above might shatter under its own weight. Camilla entered the room, visibly shaking with a mixture of disbelief and fury. She confronted Princess Anne directly, accusing her of sabotaging the public role of the queen consort and of manipulating a young woman into seizing attention that should have belonged to the reigning monarch's household. Camilla's argument centered on the slimmed-down monarchy that King Charles had championed. She claimed that Louise had never intended to serve as a working royal, that she lacked the experience for such enormous responsibilities, and that giving her the Grey Garden disrupted the long-term vision of the king. Anne, however, remained calm, composed, and resolute, embodying a quiet strength that few dared challenge. When Camilla finally paused, Anne spoke, her words soft but cutting with the precision of a blade. "Neither were you, and yet here we are." The silence that followed was described as funeral grade. Camilla reportedly left the room without a single word, finally breaking down in private. But the struggle for control was not confined to the palace's drawing rooms. A more modern, unseen war was already underway. Duchess Sophie, Louise's mother, had been anticipating this fallout for nearly a year. A former public relations expert, she understood how leaks, rumors, and character attacks could be weaponized. She knew the Parker Bowles family might resort to unofficial and more aggressive methods to reclaim influence once they realized they had lost the legal battle over the estate. In late 2025, just before the inheritance was finalized, Sophie quietly ordered a top-tier cybersecurity audit of the Grey Garden and its surrounding lands. The results were alarming. There had been multiple attempts to scan the property's roof with drones, likely searching for hidden entrances or structural weaknesses. More disturbing were reports from estate workers of remote trail cameras discovered along the northern tree line, positioned to capture anyone entering or leaving the private sanctuary. Although the culprits were never identified, the sophistication of the equipment suggested a highly organized and well-funded operation. Sophie acted swiftly. She coordinated with the Duke of Edinburgh's office to install military-grade signal jammers and ensured that Louise's personal protection detail was staffed entirely with officers whose loyalty to the late Queen was beyond question. While Sophie secured the physical and digital boundaries, Prince Edward took responsibility for protecting the family front. In November 2025, Queen Camilla reportedly made one final attempt to delay the inheritance. She called Edward personally, appealing to the idea of family unity and suggesting that the public release of the inheritance record be postponed for several months to allow for legal clarification. She framed it as a way to protect Louise from inevitable media scrutiny. Edward, often regarded as the gentlest of the siblings, revealed a streak of iron no one expected. He recognized the attempt for what it was, a stalling tactic designed to give Camilla's legal team time to search for loopholes in the Crown Archives Act. His response was short, direct, and devastating. "My daughter will not be a placeholder for your ambitions. You had your turn." What do you think about Prince William's shocking confirmation of Lady Louise's inheritance? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section. Don't forget to like and subscribe.